Not as the plants and flowers of earth, growing peacefully beneath a simple sun, were the blossoms of the planet Lophi. Coiling and uncoiling in double dawns, tossing tumultuously under vast suns of jade green and balas ruby orange, swaying and weltering in rich twilights, in aurora-curtained nights, they resembled fields of rooted serpents that dance eternally to an other-world music. Many were small and furtive, and crept viper-wise on the ground. Others were tall as pythons, rearing superbly in hieratic postures to the jewelled light. Some grew with single or dual stems that burgeoned forth into hydra beads, and some were frilled and festooned with leaves that suggested the wings of flying lizards, the pennants of fairy lances, the phylacteries of a strange sacerdotalism. Some appeared to bear the scarlet wattles of dragons. Others were tongued as if with black flames, or the coloured vapours that issue with weird writhings from out barbaric censers. And others still were armed with fleshy nets of tendrils, or with huge blossoms like bucklers perforated in battle. And all were equipped with venomous darts and fangs. All were alive, restless, and sentient. They were the lords of Lophi, and all other life existed by their sufferance. The people of the world had been their inferiors from unrecorded cycles, and even in the most primitive myths there was no suggestion that any other order of things had ever prevailed. And the plants themselves, together with the fauna and mankind of Lophi, gave immemorial obeisance to the terrible flower known as the Voral, in which a tutelary demon, more ancient than the twin suns, was believed to have made its immortal avatar. The Voral was served by a human priesthood, chosen from amid the royalty and aristocracy of Lophi. In the heart of the chief city, Lospa, in an equatorial realm, it had grown from antiquity on the summit of a high pyramid of sable terraces that loomed over the town like the hanging gardens of some greater Babylon, crowded with the lesser but deadly floral forms. At the centre of the broad apex, the Voral stood alone in a basin level with the surrounding platform of black mineral. The basin was filled with a compost in which the dust of royal mummies formed an essential ingredient. The demon flower sprang from a bulb so encrusted with the growth of ages that it resembled a stone urn. Above this there rose the gnarled stalk that had displayed in earlier times the bifurcation of a mandrake, but whose halves had now grown together into a scaly, furrowed thing like the tail of some mythic sea monster. The stalk was variegated with hues of greening bronze, of antique copper, with the livid blues and purples of fleshly corruption. It ended in a crown of stiff, blackish leaves, banded and spotted with poisonous metallic white, and edged with sharp serrations as of savage weapons. From below the crown issued a long, sinuous arm, scaled like the main stem, and serpentining downward and outward to terminate in the huge upright bowl of a bizarre blossom, as if the arm, in sardonic fashion, should hold out a hellish beggar's cup. Abhorrent and monstrous was the bowl, which, like the leaves, was legended to renew itself at intervals of 1,000 years. It smouldered with sullen ruby at the base. It lightened into zones of dragon's blood, into belts of the rose of infernal sunset, on the full, swelling sides, and it flamed at the rim to a hot, yellowish nacreate red, like the ichor of salamanders. To one who dared peer within, the cup was lined with sepulchral violet, blackening toward the bottom, pitted with myriad pores, and streaked with turgescent veins of sulphurous green. Swaying in a slow, lethal, hypnotic rhythm, with a deep and solemn sibilation, the Voral dominated the city of Lospa and the world Lophi. Below, on the tiers of the pyramid, The thronged ophidian plants kept time to this rhythm in their tossing and hissing. And far beyond Losper, to the poles of the planet and in all its longitudes, the living blossoms obeyed the sovereign tempo of the Voral. Boundless was the power exercised by this being over the people who, for want of a better name, I have called the humankind of Lafai. Myriad and frightful were the legends that had gathered through eons about the Voral, and dire was the sacrifice demanded each year at the summer solstice by the demon. The filling of its proffered cup with the lifeblood of a priest or priestess, chosen from amid the assembled hierophants who passed before the Voral, till the poised cup, inverted and empty, descended like a devil's mitre on the head of one of their number. Luni, king of the realms about Losper and high priest of the Voral, was the last, if not the first, of his race to rebel against this singular tyranny. There were dim myths of some primordial ruler who had dared to refuse the required sacrifice, and whose people, in consequence, had been decimated by a mortal war with the serpentine plants which, obeying the demon, had uprooted themselves everywhere from the soil and had marched on the cities of Lafai, slaying or vampirizing all who fell in their way. Luni, from childhood, had obeyed implicitly and without question the will of the floral overlord, had offered the stated worship, had performed the necessary rites. To withhold them would have been blasphemy. He had not dreamed of rebellion till, at the time of the annual choosing of the victim, and 30 suns before the date of his nuptials with Nalah, priestess of the Voral, he saw the hesitant, inverted grail come down in deathly crimson on the fair head of his betrothed. A sorrowful consternation, a dark, sullen dismay which he sought to smother in his heart, was experienced by Luni. Nalah, dazed and resigned in a mystic inertia of despair, accepted her doom without question, but a blasphemous doubt formed itself surreptitiously in the mind of the king. Trembling with his own impiety, he asked himself if there was not some way in which he could save Nalah, could cheat the demon of its ghastly tribute. To do this, and escape with impunity to himself and his subjects, he knew that he must strike at the very life of the monster, which was believed to be deathless and invulnerable. It seemed impious even to wonder concerning the truth of this belief, which had long assumed the force of a religious tenet, and was held unanimously. Amid such reflections, Luni remembered an old myth about the existence of a neutral and independent being known as the Ecliff, a demon coeval with the Voral, and allied neither to man nor the flower creatures. This being was said to dwell beyond the desert of Afon, in the otherwise unpeopled mountains of white stone above the habitat of the ophidian blossoms. In latter days no man had seen the Ecliff, for the journey through Afon was not likely to be undertaken. But this entity was supposed to be immortal, and it kept apart and alone, meditating upon all things, but interfering never with their processes. However, it was said to have given, in earlier times, valuable advice to a certain king who had gone forth from Losper to its lair among the white crags. In his grief and desperation, Luni resolved to seek the Ecliff and question it about the possibility of slaying the Voral. If, by any mortal means, the demon could be destroyed, he would remove from Lafai the long-established tyranny whose shadow fell upon all things from the sable pyramid. It was necessary for him to proceed with utmost caution, to confide in no one, to veil his very thoughts at all times from the occult scrutiny of the Voral. In the interim of 5 days between the choosing of the victim and the consummation of the sacrifice, he must carry out his mad plan. Unattended and disguised as a simple hunter of beasts, he left his palace during the short 3-hour night of universal slumber, and stole forth towards the desert of Aphon. In the dawn of the Balas ruby sun he had reached the pathless waste, and was toiling painfully over its knife-sharp bridges of dark stone, like the waves of a mountain ocean petrified in storm. Soon the rays of the green sun were added to those of the other, and Aphon became a painted inferno through which Lunithi dragged his way, crawling from scarp to glassy scarp, or resting at whiles in the coloured shadows. There was no water anywhere, but swift mirages gleamed and faded, and the shifting sand appeared to run like rills in the bottom of deep valleys. At setting of the first sun he came within sight of the pale mountains beyond Aphon, towering like cliffs of frozen foam above the desert's dark sea. They were tinged with transient lights of azure, of jade and orange in the going of the yellow-red orb and the westward slanting of its binary. Then the lights melted into beryl and tourmaline, and the green sun was regnant over all, until it too went down, leaving a twilight whose colours were those of sea-water. In the gloom Lunithi reached the foot of the pale crags, and there, exhausted, he slept till the second dawn. Rising, he began his escalade of the white mountains. They rose bleak and terrible before him against the hidden suns, with cliffs that were like the sheer terraces of gods. Like the king who had preceded him in the ancient myth, he found a precarious way that led upward through narrow, broken chasms. At last he came to the vaster fissure, riving the heart of the White Range, by which it was possible to reach the legendary lair of the Ecliff. The chasm's beetling walls rose higher and higher above him, shutting out the suns, but creating with their whiteness a wan and deathly glimmer to illumine his way. The fissure was such as might have been cloven by the sword of a macrocosmic giant. It led downward, steepening ever, like a wound that pierced to the heart of Lafai. Lunithi, like all of his race, was able to exist for prolonged periods without other nutriment than sunlight and water. He had brought with him a metal flask, filled with the aqueous element of Lafai, from which he drank sparingly as he descended the chasm, for the white mountains were waterless, and he feared to touch the pools and streams of unknown fluids upon which he came at intervals in the dusk. There were sanguine-coloured springs that fumed and bubbled before him to vanish in fathomless rifts, and brooklets of mercurial metal, green, blue, or amber, that wound beside him like liquescent serpents, and then slipped away into dark caverns. Acrid vapours rose from clefts in the chasm, and Lunithi felt himself among strange chemistries of nature. In this fantastic world of stone, which the plants of Lafai could never invade, he seemed to have gone beyond the Vorkal's grim, diabolic tyranny. At last he came to a clear, watery pool, occupying almost the entire width of the chasm. In passing it he was forced to scramble along a narrow, insecure ledge at one side. A fragment of the marble stone, breaking away beneath his footfall, dropped into the pool as he gained the opposite edge, and the hueless liquid foamed and hissed like 1,000 vipers. Wondering as to its properties, and fearful of the venomous hissing, which did not subside for some time, Lunithi hurried on, and came after an interval to the fissure's end. Here he emerged in the huge crater-like pit that was the home of the Ecliff. Fluted and columned walls went up to a stupendous height on all sides, and the sun of orange ruby, now at zenith, was pouring down a vertical cataract of gorgeous fires and shadows. Addorsed against the farther wall of the pit in an upright posture, he beheld that being known as the Ecliff, which had the likeness of a high cruciform pillar of blue mineral, shining with its own esoteric lustre. Going forward, he prostrated himself before the pillar, and then, in accents that quavered with a deep awe, he ventured to ask the desired oracle. For a while the Ecliff maintained its aeon-old silence. Peering timidly, the king perceived the twin lights of mystic silver that brightened and faded with a slow, rhythmic pulsation in the arms of the blue cross. Then, from the lofty, shining thing, there issued a voice that was like the tinkling of mineral fragments lightly clashed together, but which somehow shaped itself into articulate words. "It is possible," said the Ecliff, "to slay the plant known as the Voral, in which an elder demon has its habitation. Though the flower has attained millennial age, it is not necessarily immortal, for all things have their proper term of existence and decay, and nothing has been created without its corresponding agency of death. I do not advise you to slay the plant, but I can furnish you with the information which you desire. In the mountain chasms through which you came to seek me, there flows a hueless spring of mineral poison, deadly to all the ophidian plant life of this world." The Ecliff went on, and told Lunithy the method by which the poison should be prepared and administered. The chill, toneless, tinkling voice concluded, "I have answered your question. If there is anything more that you wish to learn, it would be well to ask me now." Prostrating himself again, Lunithy gave thanks to the Ecliff, and, considering that he had learned all that was requisite, he did not avail himself of the opportunity to question further the strange entity of living stone. And the Ecliff, cryptic and aloof in its termless, impenetrable meditation, apparently saw fit to vouchsafe nothing more except in answer to a direct query. Withdrawing from the marble-walled abyss, Lunithy returned in haste along the chasm till, reaching the pool of which the Ecliff had spoken, he paused to empty his flask and fill it with the angry, hissing liquid. Then he resumed his homeward journey. At the end of 2 days, after incredible fatigues and torments in the blazing hell of a faun, he reached Losper in the time of darkness and slumber, as when he had departed. Since his absence had been unannounced, it was supposed that he had retired to the underground Adita below the pyramid of the Voral for purposes of prolonged meditation, as was sometimes his wont. In alternate hope and trepidation, dreading the miscarriage of his plan, and shrinking still from its audacious impiety, Lunithy awaited the night preceding that double dawn of summer solstice when, in a secret room of the Black Pyramid, the monstrous offering was to be made ready. Nalah would be slain by a fellow priest or priestess, chosen by lot, and her blood would drip from the channelled altar into a great cup, and the cup would then be carried with solemn rites to the Voral, and its contents poured into the evilly supplicative bowl of the sanguinated blossom. He saw little of Nalah during that interim. She was more withdrawn than ever, and seemed to have consecrated herself wholly to the coming doom. To no one, and least of all to his beloved, did Lunithy dare to hint at a possible prevention of the sacrifice. There came the dreaded eve, with a swiftly changing twilight of jewelled hues that turned to a darkness hung with auroral flame. Lunithy stole across the sleeping city, and entered the pyramid whose blackness towered massively amid the frail architecture of buildings that were little more than canopies and lattices of stone. With infinite care and caution he made the preparations prescribed by the Ecliff. Into the huge sacrificial cup of black metal, in a room lit with stored sunlight, he emptied the seething, sibilant poison he had brought with him from the White Mountains. Then, opening adroitly a vein in one of his arms, he added a certain amount of his own blood to the lethal potion, above whose floating crystal it floated like a magic oil, without mingling, so that the entire cup, to all appearance, was filled with the liquid most acceptable to the satanic blossom. Bearing in his hands the black grail, Lunithi ascended a hewn stairway that led to the Vorqual's presence. His heart quailing, his senses swooning in chill gulfs of terror, he emerged on the lofty summit above the shadowy town. In a luminous azure gloom, against the weird and iridescent streamers of light that foreran the double dawn, he saw the dreamy swaying of the monstrous plant, and heard its somnolent hissing that was answered drowsily by myriad blossoms on the tiers below. A nightmare oppression, black and tangible, seemed to flow from the pyramid and to lie in stagnant shadow on all the lands of Lafai. Aghast at his own temerity, and deeming that his shrouded thoughts would surely be understood as he drew nearer, or that the Vorqual would be suspicious of an offering brought before the accustomed hour, Lunithi made obeisance to his floral suzerain. The Vorqual vouchsafed no sign that it had deigned to perceive his presence, but the great flower cup, with its flaring crimsons dulled to garnet and purple in the twilight, was held forward as if in readiness to receive the hideous gift. Breathless and fainting with religious fear, in a moment of suspense that scented eternal, Lunithi poured the blood-mantled poison into the cup. The venom boiled and hissed like a wizard's brew as the thirsty flower drank it up, and Lunithi saw the scaled arm draw back, tilting its demon grail quickly, as if to repudiate the doubtful potion. It was too late, for the poison had been absorbed by the blossom's porous lining. The tilting motion changed in mid-air to an agonized writhing of the reptilian arm, and then the Vorqual's huge, scaly stalk and pointed leaf crown began to toss in a deathly dance, waving darkly against the auroral curtains of morn. Its deep hissing sharpened to an insupportable note, fraught with the pain of a dying devil, and, looking down from the platform edge on which he crouched to avoid the swaying growth, Lunithi saw that the lesser plants on the terraces were now tossing in a mad unison with their master. Like noises in an ill dream, he heard the chorus of their tortured sibilations. He dared not look again at the Vorqual, till he became aware of a strange silence, and saw that the blossoms below had ceased to writhe, and were drooping limply on their stems. Then, incredulous, he knew that the Vorqual was dead. Turning in triumph mingled with horror, he beheld the flaccid stalk that had fallen prone on its bed of unholy compost. He saw the sudden withering of the stiff, sordid leaves, of the gross and hellish cup. Even the stony bulb appeared to collapse and crumble before his eyes. The entire stem, its evil colours fading swiftly, shrank and fell in upon itself, like a sere, empty serpent skin. At the same time, in some obscure manner, Lunithi was still aware of a presence that brooded above the pyramid. Even in the death of the Vorqual, it seemed to him that he was not alone. Then, as he stood and waited, fearing he knew not what, he felt the passing of a cold and unseen thing in the gloom, a thing that flowed across his body like the thick coils of some enormous python, without sound, in dark, clammy undulations. A moment more and it was gone, and Lunithi no longer felt the brooding presence. He turned to go, but it seemed that the dying night was full of an unconceived terror that gathered before him as he went down the long sombre stairs. Slowly he descended, and a weird despair was upon him. He had slain the Voral, had seen it wither in death. Yet he could not believe the thing he had done. The lifting of the ancient doom was still no more than an idle myth. The twilight brightened as he passed through the slumbering city. According to custom, no one would be abroad for another hour. Then the priests of the Voral would gather for the annual blood offering. Midway between the pyramid and his own palace, Lunithi was more than startled to meet the maiden Nalah. Pale and ghostly, she glided by him with a swift and swaying movement almost serpentine, which differed oddly from her habitual languor. Lunithi dared not accost her when he saw her shut, unheeding eyes, like those of a somnambulist, and he was awed and troubled by the strange ease, the unnatural surety of her motion, which reminded him of something which he feared to remember. In a turmoil of fantastic doubt, he followed. Threading the exotic maze of Lospa with the fleet and sinuous glide of a homing serpent, Nalah entered the sacred pyramid. Lunithi, less swift than she, had fallen behind, and he knew not where she had gone in the myriad vaults and chambers. But a dark and fearsome intuition drew his steps without delay to the platform of the summit. He knew not what he should find, but his heart was drugged with an esoteric hopelessness, and he was aware of no surprise when he came forth in the dawn and beheld the thing which awaited him. The maiden Nalah, or that which he knew to be Nalah, was standing in the basin of evil compost, above the withered remains of the Voral. She had undergone, was still undergoing, a monstrous and diabolic metamorphosis. Her frail, slight body had assumed a long and dragon-like shape, and the tender skin was marked off in incipient scales that darkened with a mottling of baleful hues. Her head was no longer recognizable as such, and the human lineaments were flaring into a weird semicircle of pointed leaf buds. Her lower limbs had joined together, had rooted themselves in the ground. One of her arms was becoming a part of the reptilian bole, and the other was lengthening into a scaly stem that bore the dark red bud of a sinister blossom. More and more the monstrosity took on the similitude of the Voral, and Lunithi, crushed by the ancient awe and dark, terrible faith of his ancestors, could feel no longer any doubt of its true identity. Soon there was no trace of Nalah in the thing before him, which began to sway with a sinuous python-like rhythm, and to utter a deep and measured sibilation, to which the plants on the lower tiers responded. He knew then that the Voral had returned to claim its sacrifice, and preside forever above the city of Lospa and the world Lofai.